The Young and the Restless spoilers. In the dimly lit basement, air was thick with tension, fear. Sharon's heart pounded as she glanced back at her two daughters, Mariah and Faith, who were blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to engulf their lives. She had been teetering on the edge for days, wrestling with the demons that Cameron had unleashed upon her. His sudden reappearance had reignited old fears and compelled her to take drastic measures. It had all started so innocently. Sharon, always protective of her daughters, had noticed their concern as they watched her more closely, sensing that something was amiss. They were sharp, intuitive, and they loved her deeply. But Sharon knew that love would turn to horror if they discovered the truth. And then, like a ghost from the past, Cameron emerged from the shadows, presence a cold, suffocating weight on her chest. Cameron had always been manipulative, a master of psychological games. He had returned to Sharon's life with a new plan, one that required her complete obedience. He had whispered his demands into her ear, leaving her with no choice but to comply. And now, standing in that basement, he was here again, his voice a low, menacing growl. "Silence them, Sharon," he ordered, his eyes glinting with a mix of malevolence and satisfaction. "Our plan must succeed." The words struck Sharon like a dagger, piercing the last remnants of her resistance. She had tried to protect her daughters from the darkness that Cameron represented, but in the end, she had succumbed to it, herself. With trembling hands, Sharon approached Mariah and Faith, her heart breaking with every step. They looked up at her with trust in their eyes, and it took everything within her to mask the turmoil that raged inside her. "I'm sorry," Sharon whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Before they could react, she administered the sedative, watching as their bodies went limp in her arms. The guilt was immediate and overwhelming, but there was no turning back. Sharon knew she had to finish what she had started, for Cameron had made it clear that failure was not an option. With her daughters safely locked away in the soundproof room, Sharon took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The plan had been set in motion, and there was no stopping it now. She had one goal: to drive a wedge between Adam and Nick, to sow discord and hatred between the two brothers. Cameron had made her believe that this was the only way to protect her family, to keep them safe from the forces that sought to tear them apart. But as she walked up the stairs, leaving her daughters behind, a new fear gripped her. Mariah had called out to her as the sedative took effect, her voice tinged with confusion and terror. And then, in the silence that followed, Sharon had done something she could never have imagined. She had called out Cameron's name, speaking to him as if he were Mariah, though groggy from the sedative, had heard her mother's frantic whispers, the way she had pleaded with Cameron as if he were a phantom haunting her every thought. The sound of her mother's voice, so filled with fear and desperation, sent chills down Mariah's spine. She tried to scream for help, but her voice was swallowed by the thick, impenetrable walls of the basement. The room was a prison, designed to keep its occupants hidden and isolated from the world above. Meanwhile, upstairs, Sharon's mind was racing. She had to act quickly before Nick or Adam suspected anything. She had to plant the seeds of doubt and mistrust to ensure that they would turn on each other. But even as she plotted their downfall, part of her longed to turn back, to undo the terrible wrong she had done to her daughters. The guilt gnawed at her, threatening to consume her entirely. As the hours passed, Nick began to grow uneasy. He hadn't heard from Mariah or Faith, and his calls to Sharon went unanswered. A knot of worry formed in his stomach as he tried to reach out to them, but there was only silence. It wasn't like them to disappear without a word. Nick's mind started to race with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Desperate, Nick decided to go to Sharon's house, hoping to find some answers. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that his daughters were in danger. But even as he drove through the quiet streets of Genoa City, he couldn't bring himself to believe that Sharon, his ex-wife, the mother of his children, could be behind their disappearance. Sharon had always been strong, loving, and fiercely protective of her family. The idea that she could harm their daughters in any way was unthinkable. When Nick arrived at Sharon's house, the sight that greeted him was chilling. The lights were dimmed, and the air was thick with an eerie stillness. Called out for Mariah and Faith, his voice echoing through the empty rooms. But there was no answer, only the sound of his own breathing as he moved through the house, searching for any sign of them. In the basement, Mariah's panic was growing. The effects of the sedative were wearing off, and she was fully aware of the nightmare she was trapped in. She could hear the faint sounds of Nick calling out, but no matter how loudly she screamed, her voice couldn't reach him. She pounded on the walls, desperate to break free. But the room was a fortress, designed to keep its occupants hidden from the outside world. Nick's search led him to the basement door, which was locked tight. A sense of dread washed over him as he realized that the key to his daughter's whereabouts might be behind that door. He called out to Sharon again, but this time there was no answer. He had to find a way to open the door, to uncover whatever secrets lay.